The champagne flutes caught the light of the crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceilings of Casa Batlló, transforming the private gallery event into a constellation of golden stars. Alina stood perfectly still near the stained glass window, its modernist curves casting kaleidoscope patterns across the polished marble floor. Barcelona's elite moved through the space like sharks circling prey, art collectors, tech moguls, old money families whose names were etched into the city's history long before Gaudí ever touched stone. She had chosen her position carefully, not too close to the center of attention, not hidden in the shadows, visible enough to matter, distant enough to observe. 7 years of marriage to Tristan Ormond had taught her the geography of power in rooms like this. Where to stand, when to smile, how to make herself just interesting enough to be useful, just quiet enough to be forgotten. The laughter reached her first, high-pitched, performative, designed to carry across marble and bodies. Then came the words, spoken in Spanish, but meant for English-speaking ears, meant specifically for her ears. Can you imagine bringing her to an event like this? I suppose he thought exotic would impress the art crowd. Alina's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her champagne flute. She didn't need to turn to know who spoke. Catalina Rivas, 26, bone-thin, draped in designer labels like armor, her pale skin luminous under the carefully positioned gallery lights. The woman who had been sleeping with her husband for 8 months. What Alina didn't know yet, what would crack through her chest like a fissure through ancient stone, was that everyone else in that room already knew. The affair wasn't a secret. It was a spectacle. And she had been the only one not invited to watch. Alina had met Tristan in London 7 years ago at a technology conference where she was presenting her doctoral research on machine learning algorithms for medical diagnostics. He'd been in the front row, leaning forward with the focused intensity of someone genuinely interested rather than simply networking. After her presentation, he'd approached with questions that demonstrated he'd actually understood her work, a rarity in rooms full of investors looking for buzzwords to monetize. "You're going to change medicine," he'd said, his Spanish accent softening the English words, "and I'd like to help you do it." 3 months later, she'd moved to Barcelona. 6 months after that, they were married in a small ceremony in the Gothic quarter, surrounded by medieval stone walls that had witnessed centuries of promises. Her mother had flown in from Atlanta, proud and nervous, smoothing down her daughter's natural curls with trembling fingers. "You sure about this, baby?" she'd whispered. "Spain is a long way from home." But Barcelona had felt like possibility. The city was a collision of old and new. Gothic cathedrals, standing defiant beside modernist masterpieces. Narrow medieval streets opening suddenly onto broad boulevards lined with plane trees. Tristan's family owned textile factories in the industrial outskirts, old Catalan money that had survived wars and regime changes. They'd welcomed her with polite smiles and careful distance, the kind of acceptance that felt like tolerance in formal wear. She'd thrown herself into building their tech startup, Algomedics, using her research to develop diagnostic software that could predict cardiac events before they happened. Tristan handled the business side, investors, partnerships, the endless networking that seemed to be conducted entirely in private clubs and gallery openings. He'd been good at it, charming in that effortless way of people raised to believe rooms existed for their comfort. Their apartment overlooked Passeig de Gràcia, one of Barcelona's most expensive streets. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed views of Casa Milà's undulating stone facade, Gaudí's surrealist dream of a building that seemed to breathe. Inside, everything was carefully curated, mid-century furniture, abstract art from emerging Catalan artists, bookshelves arranged by color. It looked like the kind of life featured in architectural magazines. It felt like a museum where she was both curator and exhibit. The cracks had started small, Tristan coming home later, distracted during conversations, his phone always face down on surfaces, classic signs that she'd initially dismissed because they were too obvious, too cliché. Surely her husband, her brilliant, supportive husband, who'd believed in her research when others dismissed it, wouldn't be so predictable. Then came the discovery. Not through detective work or dramatic confrontation, but through a forgotten iPad left on the kitchen counter, a message notification lighting up the screen. "Last night was perfect. I love how you taste." She'd stood in their pristine kitchen, with its imported Italian tiles and custom cabinetry, staring at those words until they stopped making sense, until they became abstract shapes rather than a grenade detonating her reality. The sender, Catalina Rivas, a name she'd heard at dinner parties, daughter of some real estate magnate, young, Spanish, everything Alina wasn't. She confronted him that evening. Tristan had been apologetic in that distant way of people confessing to minor inconveniences rather than devastation. "It's complicated," he'd said, as if complexity absolved betrayal. "You're always working. We've grown apart. Catalina understands my world in ways you never—" He'd stopped himself, but the words hung there anyway. "In ways you never could." He'd promised to end it. Counseling was discussed. Schedules would be adjusted. They would work on their marriage. That vague phrase people used when they meant one person would shrink themselves to accommodate the other's unhappiness. Alina had wanted to believe it. So she'd done what she always did, worked harder, tried to be more present, attended more events, smiled wider at strangers who looked through her like she was decorative rather than dimensional. She'd made herself smaller, quieter, more palatable. But the affair hadn't ended. It had simply gone underground, transformed from carelessness to conspiracy. And Barcelona's elite, that insular world of inherited wealth and centuries-old family connections, had watched it happen, with the detached amusement of people for whom other people's pain was just entertainment between courses. The gallery opening at Casa Batlló was supposed to be important for their company. Algomedics had finally secured Series B funding, and several potential clients would be there: hospital administrators, health insurance executives, people whose approval could transform their startup from promising to profitable. Tristan had insisted she attend, despite her exhaustion from weeks of testing their latest software update. She'd arrived alone. Tristan was running late, a delay that had stretched from 30 minutes to an hour. She'd moved through the space, making small talk with strangers, explaining her company's technology to people who nodded politely while their eyes searched for someone more interesting to engage. That's when she'd seen them. Tristan and Catalina, entering together through the main entrance, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. They weren't hiding. They were arriving as a couple, as if this arrangement was understood, accepted, obvious to everyone except the wife standing alone by the stained glass window. The room's energy had shifted. Conversations stuttered. Eyes flickered toward Alina, then away, the social equivalent of looking away from an accident. She'd felt it then, the realization that this wasn't a secret at all. It was a narrative she'd been excluded from, a story where she was the punchline everyone had already heard. Catalina had seen her first. Their eyes met across the gallery floor, and instead of embarrassment or shame, Alina saw something far worse. Amusement. Pure, undiluted satisfaction. Then Catalina had turned to the woman beside her, another young socialite whose family owned half of Sarria Saint-Gervasi, and laughed, that bright, carrying laugh that cut through jazz music and champagne conversation. Can you imagine? Bringing her to an event like this? I suppose he thought exotic would impress the art crowd. The words were in Spanish, but Alina's fluency was perfect. She'd spent 7 years in this city, learned the language, absorbed the culture, tried to belong. And here was the truth, delivered with casual cruelty. She would always be an outsider, always the black American wife who didn't quite fit, always other. Tristan hadn't even looked uncomfortable. He'd simply guided Catalina further into the room, toward a cluster of potential investors, as if his wife standing frozen by the window was a problem solved by simply not acknowledging it. Alina had left quietly, slipping through a service exit that led to a narrow medieval street behind Casa Batlló. The evening air was thick with late summer warmth, carrying the scent of jasmine from balcony gardens and grilled seafood from nearby restaurants. She'd walked without direction, her heels clicking against ancient cobblestones, past street performers in Las Ramblas and tourists taking selfies in front of Gothic fountains. She'd ended up at the beach in Barceloneta, sitting on the sand with her expensive shoes abandoned beside her. The Mediterranean stretched dark and infinite before her, the city lights reflecting on its surface like fallen stars. Somewhere behind her, Barcelona continued its eternal party, clubs throbbing with music, bars spilling laughter onto streets, the city that never questioned its own beauty or right to exist. For the first time in 7 years, Alina let herself cry. Not delicate tears that could be dabbed away, but gut-wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the woman she'd been in London, confident, brilliant, full of purpose. She cried for the compromises she'd made, the pieces of herself she'd filed down, trying to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold her. She cried for the humiliation of standing in that gallery while strangers pitied her, while her husband paraded his mistress like a trophy. But somewhere between the crying and the dawn breaking over the Mediterranean, something else crystallized. Not anger. Anger was too hot, too immediate. This was colder, clearer. A recognition that the woman who'd sat down on this beach would not be the same woman who stood up. The architecture of her perfect life had been a facade, beautiful, carefully designed but hollow. And now that it had cracked open, she could finally see what needed to be built in its place. The apartment felt different when she returned at dawn. Same view of Pasig de Gracia, same carefully curated furniture, but now it all looked like stage dressing, props in someone else's production. Tristan was asleep in their bedroom, sprawled across expensive sheets like a man without worries. She'd stood in the doorway watching him, wondering how she'd spent 7 years sleeping beside someone she didn't actually know. He'd woken around 9, groggy and irritable. No mention of the gallery, no acknowledgement of his wife's absence or the public humiliation he'd orchestrated. He'd simply moved through their morning routine, espresso from their Italian machine, business news on his tablet, the performance of domesticity without its substance. "I have meetings all day," he'd said, kissing her forehead with the casual affection of habit. "Don't wait up." She'd nodded, said nothing, watched him leave. Then she'd systematically begun documenting everything: banking records, business documents, email communications. Every partnership contract, investor agreement, and intellectual property filing for Algomedics. The company they'd built together, except the paperwork told a different story. Her name appeared as technical consultant. His name was listed as founder and CEO. The algorithms she'd developed, the research she'd conducted, the late nights and early mornings spent perfecting diagnostic software, all credited to Algomedics' development team in official documentation. She'd been so focused on the science, on proving her technology worked, that she'd let Tristan handle the business details. He'd assured her it was standard practice, simplified for investors. Better optics to have a single visionary founder rather than a complicated partnership narrative. She'd trusted him. She'd been a fool. The financial records were worse. Their apartment, purchased with her inheritance from her grandmother, the money that was supposed to secure her future, was titled solely in Tristan's name. He'd explained it away during the purchase. Spanish real estate law, tax implications. Easier this way. She'd signed documents she hadn't fully read, in a language she was still learning, trusting the man she'd married. Every asset was his. Every piece of their life together had been carefully structured to exclude her from ownership. The startup she'd built, the home she'd paid for, even the car they shared, all legally his. She existed in their marriage as a ghost, present but unrecorded, essential but uncredited. The realization wasn't dramatic, it was methodical. Each document she reviewed added another piece to a picture she'd been refusing to see. This hadn't been love followed by betrayal. This had been strategy from the beginning. Her phone rang, her mother, calling from Atlanta for their weekly check-in. "Baby, you sound tired. Everything okay?" Alina had almost told her everything, almost let the words spill out. The affair, the humiliation, the systematic theft of everything she'd built. But her mother had been a single parent who'd worked 2 jobs to send her daughter to college, who'd believed in her brilliant girl's ability to transcend limitation. How could she admit she'd walked willingly into a trap? "Just busy," Alina had said. "The company's growing fast. I'm so proud of you." "My daughter, changing the world from Spain. Your grandmother would have loved seeing this." After the call ended, Alina had sat in their living room watching sunlight move across Gaudi's architecture outside their window. Her grandmother's money had bought this view. Her research had built the company. Her work had created something genuinely valuable, and all of it had been systematically transferred into Tristan's name. The affair wasn't the betrayal. It was the symptom of a much deeper theft. That evening, Tristan came home with Catalina, not sneaking in, arriving openly, laughing about something, Catalina's voice echoing in the marble entryway as if this was perfectly normal, as if wives were interchangeable accessories that could be swapped out based on preference. Alina had been in the kitchen, preparing dinner from habit rather than hunger. She'd looked up as they entered, and for a moment the 3 of them had simply stood there, a tableau of dysfunction. "Oh," Tristan said, as if surprised to find his wife in her own home, "I thought you were working late. In my own apartment?" Alina's voice was steady, calm. "Where else would I be?" Catalina had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable, but she recovered quickly. "Tristan and I were just reviewing the investor presentations for the Vienna conference. We didn't mean to intrude." Intrude in Alina's own home, purchased with her inheritance. "The spare office is available," Alina said. "For work purposes." She'd returned to chopping vegetables. Behind her she heard them retreat, heard the office door close, heard their muffled laughter. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. The affair had transitioned from secret to accepted reality. She was the one expected to adjust. Days blurred into a surreal nightmare where her husband conducted an open relationship in their shared space while she remained legally and financially trapped. Catalina appeared at the apartment regularly, for business meetings that lasted hours, for dinners where Alina was expected to host, for casual visits where she'd curl up on the sofa Alina had chosen as if claiming territory. The worst part wasn't the affair itself. It was the gaslighting that accompanied it. "You're being paranoid," Tristan would say when she questioned the arrangement. "Catalina is a business partner. Her father's investing in our next round. You're letting your insecurity sabotage the company. I'm concerned that your mistress is living in our home. Don't be dramatic. You know how important these investor relationships are. Or is your ego more important than Algomedics' success?" He'd weaponized her own creation against her, made her feel selfish for objecting to her own humiliation, convinced her that protecting herself meant destroying everything they'd built. Barcelona's social circles had their own way of enforcing this reality. At events, and Tristan insisted she attend, maintaining appearances, Women who'd once made polite conversation now looked through her as if she'd already been erased. Men who'd discussed business partnerships now directed their attention to Tristan alone, as if she'd never contributed anything of value. She'd become invisible while simultaneously being spectacle. Everyone knew about the affair. Everyone watched to see how the betrayed wife would handle her obsolescence, and the consensus, unspoken but clear, was that she should handle it gracefully, exit quietly, accept her replacement with dignity. One evening, at a rooftop event in Elborn overlooking the cathedral, she'd overheard a conversation between two investors. Shame about Tristan's situation, but these things happen. The wife seemed nice enough. Bit too serious, though. You know how these academic types are. Brilliant in the lab, awkward everywhere else. Catalina's a better fit for his ambitions. Young, well-connected, understands the social game. He needs a partner who can open doors, not someone who's a door he has to explain. They'd been talking about her like she was a business decision gone wrong, a poor investment to be cut loose. And perhaps that's all she'd ever been to Tristan, a means to access her technology, her research, her inheritance. The romance had been acquisition strategy. The breaking point came 3 months after the gallery opening. Alina had been working late at their shared office space in the Example district, running diagnostics on the latest software update. She'd heard voices in the conference room, Tristan and his lawyer, discussing business matters they thought were private. "The divorce needs to be clean," Tristan said. "She contributed to early development, but I'm the public face. The investors know me. The technology is fundamentally mine now. What about her intellectual property claims? The contracts are airtight. Everything developed during the marriage belongs to the company. I own the company. She'll get a modest settlement, enough to seem fair without being significant. She's not going to fight it. She doesn't have the resources for a prolonged legal battle. And the personal assets? The apartment is mine. The accounts are mine. I've been careful about documentation. She'll leave with essentially what she came with, nothing except her degrees and her pride. And honestly, I'm doing her a favor. She's not built for this level of business. Better she goes back to academic research where she's comfortable." Alina had stood frozen outside the conference room, listening to her life being dismantled with the casual efficiency of someone liquidating underperforming assets. This had been planned, calculated. While she'd been trying to save their marriage, he'd been constructing the legal framework to erase her. She'd left the office without confronting them, walked through Barcelona's streets for hours, past the magic fountain of Montjuic, dry and silent in winter, past the old Olympic Stadium, abandoned to tourists and joggers. She'd climbed to Bunkers del Carmel, the old anti-aircraft battery that now offered panoramic views of the entire city spread out below like a circuit board of lights. From up here, Barcelona looked beautiful, organized, logical, but she knew its medieval streets were labyrinthine, designed to confuse invaders. The city was built on layers, Roman ruins beneath Gothic structures, beneath modernist innovation. Nothing here was simple. Everything had history, strategy, purpose. She'd been trying to play by rules she didn't understand, in a game she hadn't realized she was playing. But she was a scientist. She understood systems, patterns, cause and effect. And if she'd built one successful algorithm, she could build another. This one just needed different parameters, different goals, not reconciliation, not salvaging what remained. Complete reconstruction. She descended from the bunker as dawn broke over the Mediterranean, the same sea that had witnessed her breakdown 3 months ago. But the woman climbing down those concrete steps was different from the one who'd cried on the beach. Crying was surrender. Planning was warfare. And Alina was very, very good at planning. The decision, once made, brought crystalline clarity. Alina stopped trying to save her marriage, stopped attending events where she was spectacle rather than participant, stopped living in the apartment that had become a stage for her own humiliation. She rented a small studio in Gracia, the bohemian neighborhood where artists and students lived in buildings adorned with tilework and wrought-iron balconies. It was the opposite of Pasig de Gracia's luxury, cramped, old, with temperamental plumbing, but it was hers. Tristan barely noticed her departure. He'd responded to her text about needing space with a thumbs-up emoji and a reminder about the Vienna Investor Conference in 2 weeks. Catalina moved into the apartment the next day. The replacement was seamless, but Alina had taken something with her. Not furniture or jewelry or any of the physical trappings of their life together. She'd taken the original code, her algorithms, the foundational work that made algomedics valuable. Before founding the company, she documented everything in personal research journals, notebooks filled with equations, failed experiments, breakthrough moments. She'd been methodical, a habit from her doctoral work where attribution mattered. She'd uploaded everything to a private server, academic practice for protecting intellectual property. Tristan hadn't known about this archive. He'd assumed the company files were the only record, that controlling algomedics meant controlling her work. He'd been wrong. Now, in her tiny Gracia studio, surrounded by second-hand furniture and windows that looked onto a narrow street where neighbors shouted between balconies, Alina began reverse engineering her own creation, not to copy it. That would be theft. But to understand what she'd built in order to build something better. Algomedics used machine learning to predict cardiac events. Valuable, yes, but limited in scope. She'd designed it to be conservative, focused, marketable to a specific segment of medical institutions. But the underlying algorithm could do more, much more. She'd always known this, but had simplified the application to make it commercially viable, to make it something Tristan could sell to investors who wanted clear ROI. Now she didn't need to simplify anything. She could build what the technology was actually capable of. She worked 18-hour days, surviving on coffee and pastries from the bakery downstairs. Her studio became a lab, laptop surrounded by notebooks, walls covered in printed charts and equations. The algorithm evolved. Instead of just cardiac prediction, she developed a comprehensive diagnostic system that could analyze multiple biomarkers simultaneously, predicting not just heart disease, but a constellation of conditions before they became critical. It was the project she'd always wanted to build. Algomedics was the commercial version. This was the masterpiece. She called it Lumina Diagnostics, a name that meant light, illumination, seeing what was hidden. She registered it quietly through a startup accelerator in London, using her maiden name, Dr. Alina Ward. Not Ormond. Never Ormond again. The technical work was straightforward. The legal work was more complex. She'd hired a lawyer, Marta Jimenez, a fierce Catalan attorney who specialized in intellectual property and founder disputes. Marta had reviewed the Algomedics contracts with the cold precision of a surgeon examining diseased tissue. "Your husband was very careful," Marta said during their second meeting in a cramped office in the Gothic Quarter where law books lined walls and a single window looked onto a medieval courtyard. "Everything developed during the course of the marriage belongs to the company. He owns the company, seemingly airtight." "Seemingly? Your initial research predates the marriage. These notebooks," Marta gestured to the journals Alina had brought, "these are dated 2 years before you even met him. Your doctoral work, your early algorithms, this is independently yours. What you contributed to Algomedics was a simplified, commercialized version of work you owned before he existed in your life. So I'm not stealing from Algomedics. You're developing your own independent technology based on your pre-existing research. Algomedics has its version, you have yours, and if yours is substantially different, which it is, then there's no infringement. He took your idea and made it narrow. You're taking your idea and making it expansive. Different applications, different code, different market. Will he sue? Almost certainly, but he'll lose. More importantly, Marta leaned forward, her expression sharp. Discovery in an IP lawsuit means everything becomes public. All those contracts you signed, all those convenient arrangements, his financial manipulations, your contributions that he erased from record, everything gets exposed. He's built a house of cards, Alina. One strong legal wind and it collapses. For the first time in months, Alina smiled. Not from happiness. This wasn't happiness. This was recognition. She'd been so focused on the betrayal of the affair that she'd missed the larger pattern. Tristan was a fraud, a man who'd built his success by stealing credit, by manipulating contracts, by making himself indispensable while rendering his partners invisible. She wasn't his first victim, just his most recent. I want to be ready before he knows I'm a threat, Alina said. Can we keep Lumina Diagnostics quiet? For a while, but eventually, if this works, when this works, he'll notice. Are you prepared for that? Was she prepared? Alina thought about the gallery opening, the apartment she'd paid for that no longer felt like home, the company she'd built that no longer bore her name, the 7 years she'd spent making herself smaller while Tristan took up more space. I'm prepared, she said. Over the next 6 months, Alina lived like a ghost. She filed for legal separation, not divorce, not yet, establishing financial independence without triggering Tristan's attention. She attended required company meetings remotely, contributing minimal input, letting everyone assume she'd accepted her diminished role. She watched from a distance as Tristan paraded Catalina through Barcelona's social scene, the new power couple of tech innovation. Let them think she'd broken. Let them think she'd surrendered. Meanwhile, Lumina Diagnostics grew. She'd partnered with a hospital network in Manchester that was willing to pilot her comprehensive system. Early results were extraordinary. Diagnostic accuracy exceeding anything currently on the market, including Algomedics. She'd presented findings at a medical conference in Amsterdam, not under Algomedics' banner, but as an independent researcher. Medical journals requested papers. Other hospitals inquired about trials. She'd rebuilt her reputation quietly, outside the spotlight, among people who cared about actual innovation rather than social performance. The Vienna Investor Conference approached, the event Tristan had mentioned months ago. Algomedics was pitching for Series C funding, a massive round that would cement the company's valuation. Tristan had been preparing for months, polishing presentations, courting investors. This was supposed to be his triumph. The moment that transformed him from promising entrepreneur to tech leader. Alina wasn't invited. She was technically still a consultant on paper, but Tristan had made clear her presence wasn't required. Catalina would accompany him instead, the new face of Algomedics' expansion. Perfect. 3 days before Tristan left for Vienna, Alina published her first paper on Lumina Diagnostics in The Lancet, one of the world's most prestigious medical journals. The article detailed her comprehensive diagnostic system, the clinical trial results, the potential to revolutionize preventive medicine. She included footnotes acknowledging that some preliminary work had been conducted during her time with Algomedics, but emphasizing that Lumina Diagnostics represented a fundamentally different approach, broader, more sophisticated, more effective. The medical community responded immediately. Within hours, her email flooded with inquiries. By the next morning, tech news outlets had picked up the story. Researcher behind Algomedics announces superior diagnostic system. Tristan called her 17 times that day. She didn't answer. She did, however, send a single email. Your Vienna presentation might want to address how Algomedics plans to compete with superior technology in the same market. Thought you should know before the investors ask. A. His response came within minutes, all caps, incoherent with rage, threats of lawsuits. Accusations of theft, demands she retract the paper. Marta had been ready. She'd responded within the hour with a detailed legal letter explaining that Lumina Diagnostics was based on Dr. Ward's independent research, that no proprietary Algomedics information had been used, and that any attempt to suppress Dr. Ward's scientific work would result in a countersuit that would expose Algomedics' questionable IP practices to public scrutiny. Do you really want discovery? Marta's letter concluded. We have documentation of every contribution Dr. Ward made to Algomedics that you credited to yourself. We have evidence of financial manipulation. We have records of every contract you maneuvered her into signing without proper legal representation. This can be a quiet competition between two products in the marketplace, or it can be a very loud examination of how you built your company. Your choice. Tristan went to Vienna. Without Catalina, apparently investors preferred he maintain the appearance of marital stability when asking for $100 million. His presentation by all accounts went poorly. Investors had read the Lancet paper. They'd seen the comparative data. They had questions about why Algomedics' technology was less sophisticated than work produced by its own former consultant. The funding round that was supposed to launch Tristan into tech stardom collapsed. Not dramatically. Money people rarely create drama, but through a series of polite deferrals and suggestions to revisit this next quarter. Alina learned about it through industry contacts, through the whisper network of researchers and developers who understood exactly what had happened. She'd beaten him, not with social maneuvering or revenge plots, but with what she'd always been best at, building something that actually worked. Spring arrived in Barcelona with that particular golden light that made the entire city look like it was glowing from within. Alina had moved from her tiny Gracia studio into a proper office space, a converted industrial loft in Poblenou, Barcelona's innovation district. The area had once been factories and warehouses. Now it housed tech startups and creative studios. The building had exposed brick and steel beams, massive windows that let in Mediterranean sun, and a rooftop terrace overlooking the sea. Lumina Diagnostics had grown faster than she'd anticipated. The Manchester hospital trials had been so successful that other institutions across Europe wanted in. She'd secured proper funding, not from Barcelona's insular elite, but from London-based venture capital firms who cared about results rather than lineage. She'd hired a team, 3 software engineers, 2 medical researchers, and a business operations manager who actually understood the work rather than just the pitch. Her team was diverse in ways that felt refreshing after years in Tristan's homogeneous world. Engineers from Morocco and India, researchers from Poland and Portugal, people who'd chosen Barcelona for opportunity rather than inheritance. The office energy was completely different from Algomedics' corporate sterility. Collaboration instead of competition, innovation instead of image management. She'd thrown herself into the work with the focused intensity of someone who finally had permission to be completely herself. No more simplifying her language for people who didn't want to understand. No more diminishing her accomplishments to make her husband feel secure. No more performing palatability. The transformation wasn't just professional. Physically, she'd changed too. She'd let her hair grow natural, thick, textured, powerful, instead of the sleek, straightened style she'd maintained for Barcelona society. She wore what felt authentic, structural pieces in rich fabrics, architectural jewelry, styles that announced presence rather than apologizing for it. She'd stopped trying to blend into spaces that didn't want her, started creating spaces that did. Her mother noticed during their video calls, "Baby, you look different, happy different." "I am happy," Alina realized as she said it. "I'm building something real." What about Tristan? What about him? The divorce proceedings had finally begun. Not amicable. Tristan was still furious about Lumina Diagnostics, still convinced she'd stolen from him despite all evidence to the contrary. But Marta had been ruthless in depositions, systematically exposing every contract manipulation, every financial sleight of hand. The apartment Alina's inheritance had purchased, she got 70% equity, the Algomedics shares in her name, restored to reflect her actual contributions. The settlement wasn't generous, it was just. Tristan fought everything, burning through legal fees in a futile attempt to maintain the narrative he'd constructed. But facts were facts, and Marta had documented them all. The court didn't care about his charm or his family name. They cared about contracts, contributions, and evidence. Algomedics was struggling. The Vienna funding collapse had triggered a cascade of problems. Investors who'd been enthusiastic became skeptical. Hospital clients started asking why they should use inferior technology when Lumina Diagnostics offered better results. Tristan's response had been to double down on marketing rather than innovation, rebranding, new spokespersons, flashier presentations, but you couldn't market your way out of having a worse product. Catalina had lasted about 4 months after the money problems began. Apparently, she'd fallen in love with successful entrepreneur Tristan, not struggling entrepreneur Tristan. She'd exited gracefully, publicly citing different professional directions, while privately making clear to Barcelona society that she'd upgraded to a Swiss banker's son. Tristan had been left with the apartment he'd manipulated to own, the company he'd stolen credit for, and the growing realization that he'd built his empire on someone else's foundation. Without Alina, he was just an average businessman with good connections and declining prospects. The industry watched this play out with the particular satisfaction people feel when someone who'd benefited from unfair advantages finally faces consequences. Stories emerged. Other women Tristan had partnered with, whose contributions had been minimized. Other founders he'd maneuvered out of their own companies. The pattern was undeniable. Alina tried not to take pleasure in his downfall. Mostly she was too busy building to pay attention. But sometimes, late at night, when she was alone in her loft office, she'd allow herself a moment of vindication, not because he was failing, but because she was succeeding. 6 months after the Lancet publication, Lumina Diagnostics received an invitation to present at the European Health Innovation Summit in Madrid. It was the industry's most prestigious conference, where major health systems and government agencies came to scout emerging technology. An invitation meant you'd arrived. You mattered. You were shaping the future of medicine. The presentation was scheduled for the main stage, prime speaking slot. Alina spent weeks preparing, not because she didn't know her material, she could explain Lumina's algorithms in her sleep, but because she wanted to be flawless. This wasn't just about technology. This was about demonstrating that the woman Barcelona's elite had dismissed was someone they should have been listening to all along. The day before her flight to Madrid, she received an unexpected visitor at her office. She was working late, finalizing slides, when the building's security called up. "Dr. Ward, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." Tristan stood in her lobby looking diminished. Not physically, he was still tall, still well-dressed, but energetically. The confidence that had always surrounded him like armor was gone, replaced by something desperate. "I need to talk to you," he said. "We have lawyers for that. Please, not about the divorce, about Algomedics." Against her better judgment, she let him up. He stood in her office space, looking around at the exposed brick and industrial aesthetic, at the team photos on the walls and the whiteboard covered in equations. This place looked nothing like the sleek corporate environment he'd cultivated. It looked like work actually happened here. "You've done well," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an accusation. "Did you come here to critique my office design?" "I came to ask you." He stopped, started again. "The Madrid summit. Algomedics was supposed to present there. We were bumped when Lumina got the main stage slot. I need you to understand what that means for the company, for our company. Your company. The court was very clear about that. Fine, my company. But Alina, I built this. You built it with my work, my algorithms, my research that you repackaged and claimed as your innovation. We built it together. You can't rewrite history just because you're angry about Catalina." The audacity was almost impressive. "This was never about Catalina," Alina said, her voice calm. "She was a symptom. The disease was your belief that you could take credit for other people's work and call it partnership, that you could manipulate contracts and call it business, that you could erase my contributions and expect me to be grateful for proximity to your ambition. So this is revenge, destroying everything we worked for. I'm not destroying anything. I'm building something better. If Algomedics can't compete, that's a business problem, not a personal attack. You could help me." He said it quietly, desperately. "If you wanted to, you could consult for Algomedics again. We could collaborate like we collaborated before, where I did the work and you took the credit. I can make it different. We can structure it properly this time. Real equity. Real recognition. Alina, please, you know this technology. You know what we could accomplish together." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw clearly what she'd been too in love to see before. Tristan wasn't a partner. He was a parasite. Charming, intelligent, effective at what he did, but fundamentally incapable of creating value himself. He needed other people's talent to fuel his ambition. Without someone to extract from, he was empty. "No," she said simply. "No. No. I'm not interested in saving your company. I'm not interested in collaboration. I'm not interested in restructuring anything. I'm focused on my own work, which is thriving specifically because it's mine. After everything I did for you..." "What did you do for me, Tristan, specifically?" He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I believed in you, when others didn't. I gave you opportunities. You extracted value from me, while systematically erasing my contributions. That's not belief. That's exploitation." "Fine." His desperation curdled into anger. "Go to Madrid. Give your presentation. Enjoy your moment. But this industry has a long memory. People know we built Algomedics together. They know you were my wife, my partner. You'll always be associated with me, whether you like it or not." Alina smiled, not cruelly, with genuine amusement. "Tristan, in 2 years, people will remember me as the founder of Lumina Diagnostics, who revolutionized preventive care. They'll remember you, if they remember you at all, as the guy who tried to claim credit for her work. That's not an association that hurts me." He left without another word. The next morning, Alina flew to Madrid. The city rose from the Castilian plateau in spring glory. Broader streets than Barcelona, imperial architecture, the massive Retiro Park blooming with roses. Her hotel overlooked Gran Via, Madrid's main artery, where theatre-goers and shoppers moved beneath ornate early 20th century buildings that looked like wedding cakes in stone. The summit was held in a converted tobacco factory, another industrial space transformed into something new, something better than its original purpose. Fitting. Backstage, before her presentation, Alina stood in the wings watching the audience file in. Healthcare administrators, government health officials. Executives from major hospital systems across Europe. These were people who controlled billion-euro budgets, who decided which technologies would shape medicine for the next decade. And they were here to hear her. The introduction was professional, focused on her credentials rather than narrative. Dr. Alina Ward, founder of Lumina Diagnostics, formerly lead researcher at Algomedics, doctorate from Imperial College London, published in The Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, Nature Medicine. She walked onto the stage, and the lights were bright and the audience was vast, and she felt absolutely no fear. If you're rooting for her like I am, show it by hitting that like button. And if you want to see more stories like this, subscribe to the channel because there's so much more coming. Because she wasn't performing anymore. She was just explaining what she'd built, and what she'd built was extraordinary. She walked the audience through Lumina's technology, not simplified for investors who wanted buzzwords, but the actual innovation. How the algorithm analyzed patterns across multiple biomarkers, how machine learning improved accuracy with each data set, how the system could predict not just single conditions but complex health trajectories, how early intervention could save lives and reduce healthcare costs simultaneously. She showed real data, actual patient outcomes, comparative studies against existing systems, including Algomedics, which she mentioned without emotion, just as one of several competitors that Lumina outperformed. When she finished, the applause was sustained. Real. The questions that followed weren't skeptical, they were engaged. How soon could this scale? What would implementation cost? Could the system adapt to regional health data variations? She answered everything clearly, directly, confidently. This was her domain. This was what she'd spent years perfecting, while others had dismissed her as an awkward academic. After the presentation, the networking session was intense. Hospital directors wanted pilots, government officials wanted feasibility studies, investors wanted meetings. She handed out business cards, scheduled follow-ups, explained technical details. She was in demand, not as someone's wife or consultant or assistant, as herself. That evening there was a gala dinner at the Palacio Real, the royal palace, a setting that would have intimidated her 7 years ago. But now she moved through ornate halls and throne rooms, converted for the night into networking space, and she felt perfectly comfortable. Because she belonged here, she'd earned her place. She was talking with a delegation from the German healthcare system when she saw him, across the gilded room, near the balcony overlooking the palace gardens. Tristan. He'd somehow gotten into the summit, probably through old connections. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Regret, anger, loss. Their eyes met across that beautiful space, and Alina felt nothing, no anger, no satisfaction, no lingering pain. He was just someone she used to know. A chapter that had closed. She turned back to the German delegation, to the conversation about implementation timelines and regulatory approval, to the future she was building. Later, standing on the palace balcony under Madrid's spring stars, she thought about that moment on the beach in Barcelona 9 months ago. The woman who'd cried there had been broken. But broken things could be rebuilt, often better than before, because you knew which parts had been weak. She wasn't the woman who'd stood silent while strangers mocked her. She wasn't the woman who'd shrunk herself to fit someone else's narrative. She was Dr. Alina Ward, founder, innovator, someone who'd turned pain into purpose and betrayal into breakthrough. And that version of herself, fierce, autonomous, uncompromising, was just getting started. 1 year after the Madrid summit, Lumina Diagnostics had become what Alina always knew it could be. The company operated in 17 countries. Hospital systems across Europe had integrated the diagnostic software into standard preventive care. The results were undeniable. Earlier disease detection, better patient outcomes, reduced long-term healthcare costs. Medical journals had published dozens of papers on Lumina's effectiveness. The technology was saving lives. Alina had moved her headquarters to a stunning space in Barcelona's Eixample district. Not Pasig de Gracia, where she'd once lived with Tristan, but nearby. A deliberate choice. She wasn't running from this city or its ghosts. She was reclaiming it on her own terms. The office occupied the top floor of a renovated modernist building, all original tilework and restored stained glass. Her team had grown to 40 people, researchers, engineers, operations staff from a dozen countries. The diversity wasn't performative. It was essential. The best people came from everywhere, and Alina had built a culture where talent mattered more than pedigree. She'd been profiled in El País, Financial Times, Wired. The articles invariably mentioned her former marriage, the Algo-Medics connection, the dramatic reversal of fortune. She'd stopped trying to control those narratives. The work spoke louder than any profile could. Algo-Medics had been acquired 6 months earlier, not by a major tech company, but by a private equity firm that specialized in distressed assets. Tristan had been removed as CEO as part of the acquisition. He'd fought it, of course, but when your company is failing and you're out of money and options, you don't get to dictate terms. Alina had heard he'd moved to London, was consulting for various startups, trading on his Barcelona connections. She wished him neither well nor ill. He'd simply become irrelevant to her story. The divorce was finally, officially complete. She'd kept her maiden name throughout, but now it felt different. Not something she'd held on to, something she'd reclaimed. Dr. Alina Ward, the name on patents and publications, the name that meant something. Her mother had visited Barcelona for the first time since the wedding. They'd walked through Park Güell, Gaudi's mosaic-covered wonderland overlooking the city, and her mother had cried. "I was so worried about you," she'd admitted. "After everything with Tristan, I thought maybe you'd want to come home." "This is home," Alina had said. "I built something here. I'm not letting anyone take this city from me." They'd sat on a bench covered in broken tile mosaics, trencadis, the technique of making beauty from fragments, and looked out over Barcelona, spreading toward the Mediterranean. The city was hers now in a way it had never been when she was trying to belong to it. She'd stopped seeking acceptance and started demanding recognition. The difference was everything. On a warm October evening, almost exactly 2 years after the gallery humiliation, Alina attended an event at Casa Batlló. The same venue where everything had shattered, the same stained glass windows and undulating architecture and wealthy crowd moving through Gaudi's fevered dream of a building. But she was there differently now, as a featured speaker for a healthcare innovation showcase, as someone whose technology was transforming European medicine, as someone who mattered. She'd stood near the same window where she'd heard Catalina's cruel laughter. The view was identical, the gallery full of Barcelona's elite, the champagne-catching chandelier light, the performance of wealth and culture. But she was seeing it as an observer rather than as someone desperate to be seen. Her presentation was brief, 15 minutes on how technology could democratize healthcare, how algorithms could catch diseases that human doctors missed, how innovation served humanity. The applause was genuine. People approached her afterward with intelligent questions, real interest. She was engaged in actual conversation rather than tolerating dismissal. Midway through the reception, she saw a familiar face. Not Tristan. She'd heard he'd been deliberately excluded from the invitation list. No, this was Catalina, 2 years older, still beautiful in that polished way of people who'd never lacked resources, but something about her looked diminished. Or perhaps Alina had just grown larger and everyone else had stayed the same size. Catalina approached hesitantly. "Alina, I wasn't sure you'd remember me." "I remember. I wanted to say—" Catalina stopped, started again. "I owe you an apology. What I did, what we did. It was cruel, unconscionable. I was young and stupid and thought—" She trailed off. "I don't have a good excuse." Alina studied her. 2 years ago, this moment would have felt satisfying. The other woman apologizing, acknowledging the pain she'd caused. But now it just felt empty. Catalina's apology couldn't change the past, couldn't return the time Alina had lost, couldn't undo the humiliation or theft or systematic erasure. "I appreciate the apology," Alina said carefully, "but I don't need it. You don't. What you did hurt me. What Tristan did was worse, but ultimately you both freed me. If he hadn't betrayed me so thoroughly, I might have stayed, kept compromising, kept shrinking myself. The cruelty forced me to rebuild, and what I built is better than anything I would have had staying. That's generous. It's not generosity, it's just truth." Alina paused. "I hope you learned something from it, about how you treat people, about complicity, about what kind of person you want to be." Catalina nodded slowly. "I did. For what it's worth, I'm sorry." She drifted away into the crowd, and Alina returned her attention to the gallery, to the conversations happening around her. She'd spoken her truth, released it. She didn't need Catalina to suffer or Tristan to fail. She just needed to keep building. Later that evening, standing on Casa Batlow's rooftop terrace, the same space where wealthy Catalans had once excluded her from their conversations, Alina looked out over Barcelona's illuminated streets. The city pulsed with eternal energy, Gothic spires rising beside modernist curves, medieval labyrinths opening onto broad contemporary boulevards. A city built on layers, constantly transforming itself while remaining fundamentally itself. She thought about the woman who'd arrived here 7 years ago, brilliant but uncertain, in love but naive, believing that accommodation equaled acceptance, that making herself smaller would make her more palatable, that love meant sublimating your own dreams to support someone else's. That woman had been destroyed in this city. And from those fragments, like Gaudí's broken tile mosaics, she'd built something stronger. The liberation hadn't come from revenge. Tristan's downfall gave her no particular satisfaction. The liberation came from recognizing that she'd never needed his validation, never needed Barcelona society's acceptance, never needed to soften her brilliance or apologize for taking up space. She'd needed only to trust herself, to build according to her own vision, to refuse to be erased. A researcher from her team joined her on the terrace. "There you are. The mayor wants to talk about expanding Lumina to Barcelona's public health system. This is huge." Alina smiled. "Let's talk about it." She followed him back into the gallery, into the light and conversation, into the future she was actively creating. Not the future someone had promised her, not the future she'd been told she deserved, but the one she'd built through her own intelligence, resilience, and refusal to accept narratives written by people who'd never understood her value. Behind her, Barcelona stretched endlessly toward the Mediterranean. The same sea that had witnessed her breakdown, the same city that had seen her humiliation, but cities, like people, could be reclaimed, could be rebuilt, could transform while remaining fundamentally themselves. She'd come to Barcelona as someone's wife, someone's accessory, someone's convenient source of expertise. She was leaving that identity behind, like a too small dress that no longer fit. Now she was simply Alina, Dr. Ward, founder, innovator, a woman who discovered that the greatest betrayal could become the catalyst for the greatest becoming, and the becoming, fierce, autonomous, uncompromising, triumphant, was just beginning. Some betrayals destroy you. Others destroy the version of yourself that was never meant to survive. Alina's story isn't ultimately about Tristan or Catalina or even Barcelona's exclusive social circles. It's about a woman who mistook accommodation for love, who confused making herself smaller with being supportive, who believed that her value came from proximity to someone else's ambition rather than from her own extraordinary capabilities. The betrayal, public, cruel, systematic, shattered that illusion. But illusions, when shattered, reveal truth. And the truth was that Alina had always been brilliant, had always been capable, had always possessed everything she needed to build something extraordinary. She just needed to build it for herself. The women who'll watch this story know this feeling, the slow erosion of self that happens when you consistently prioritize someone else's comfort over your own dignity. The way you justify it, telling yourself it's partnership, compromise, love, until one day you look up and realize you've disappeared into someone else's narrative. Liberation doesn't come from revenge. It comes from recognizing that the story you've been telling yourself about who you are and what you deserve was written by people who benefited from you believing it. The real triumph isn't Tristan's failure. It's Alina's refusal to let his betrayal define her. Her decision to use pain as raw material for transformation. Her recognition that being broken open created space for something more authentic, more powerful, more genuinely hers to grow. She didn't win by destroying him. She won by building something so undeniably excellent that his opinion became irrelevant. That's the mathematics of liberation, not subtraction, removing the people who hurt you. But multiplication, expanding into the fullness of who you always were, beneath the accommodations and compromises. To every woman who's ever made herself smaller, who's ever apologized for being brilliant, who's ever stayed because leaving felt like admitting defeat, your liberation is waiting, not in someone else recognizing your value, but in you recognizing it yourself, in you building according to your own vision, in you refusing to be edited down to fit someone else's comfort. The woman who walked into that gallery in Barcelona, uncertain, seeking belonging, willing to tolerate disrespect for access to spaces that didn't want her. She's gone. The woman who stands now is something else entirely, something fiercer, more authentic, completely undeniably triumphantly herself. And that woman, that version forged through pain and rebuilt through purpose, she's unstoppable. Your story doesn't end when someone betrays you. It begins when you decide to write the next chapter yourself,